I call this the Procrastinator's Guide because do you know when the DSM-5 was released?
May.
2013.
May 2013, yeah. So it's now almost it's close to 3 years that it's been out. So in the sense that it's already almost 3 years old, I guess in a way we're kind of procrastinators if we're catching up right now. But I do know a lot of people that really haven't transitioned yet. Now you might say, well, weren't people required to transition October 1st? That's kind of a myth in a way. A lot of people think they were required to transition to DSM-5 October 1st, 2015, but that's actually about transitioning to ICD-10 codes, which is an entirely different matter than what version of the DSM you use, although they are interrelated in some ways, but we're going to get to that also. So who am I and what do I do? My name is Aaron Norton, and I am an LMHT and LMFT, and I work in a private practice called Integrity Counseling in Largo, in Pinellas County. And my practice is mostly therapy, but it's a good amount of evaluations as well, especially substance abuse evaluation. That's my biggest area of expertise, and a lot's changed with substance abuse when it comes to the DSM-5, so we'll be covering some of that. And then I also chair the training committee for the National Board of Forensic Evaluators and the Education Committee here at FONCA, and teach as an adjunct at USF, and am pursuing my doctorate now also, so I just get to be all kinds of busy right now. So I have my email address and website on here. If there are questions that we don't get to today that you need to have answered, my invitation to you is to go ahead and email me and I'll reply. Now it might take a couple days because I prioritize client-related emails and student-related emails above all else. But I will get to it. And I'll respond.
So which one you put first?
What's that?
So weird.
Yeah, so if you trick me by saying I'm one of your students or something like that, then yes, there you go. But I will get back to you, and I'll be showing you at the end here a lot of resources that you can use. Some of them are going to be really practical, helpful resources that you can implement in your practice immediately. Some of those are internet resources, so I'll be showing you some of that information. I have a DSM-5 resource page on my website. I'll show you how to access that as well. So you'll hopefully walk away with a lot of good information here. Okay. So now we're going to, what we're going to be covering today, we're going to start off with counselors in the medical model. We're going to figure out why is it that counselors have such a difficult time when it comes to implementing DSM. Some counselors really don't like DSM. There's a lot of criticism among our profession about the DSM, and a lot of it's really valid, legitimate criticism. So we will cover some of the controversies and criticisms, and they're sort of interspersed throughout the presentation. And then we're going to look at sort of the bird's eye view, the overview of changes with the DSM. And then we're finally going to get into the nitty-gritty details. We'll start with, okay, let's look at the chapters themselves in the DSM, how they're organized conceptually, and then we'll get to the very specific disorders. What are new disorders that weren't in the DSM-4? What are some of the disorders that were scrapped, that we got rid of? And what are we also including in Section 3, looking forward to the future? What might be some new disorders that will enter into the DSM-6 when that comes out? Then I'll cover those resources with you that I told you about, and then last but not least, we'll get to questions and answers. And get out of here on time, if not early. I'm coming back here because I just kind of realized, I think I might have messed this. Oh, no, I did do it right. Okay, good. I don't see the red light on this. I didn't think it was recording. All right, now, why do we have a DSM to begin with? Anybody have any thoughts about why it even exists? What's the purpose of the DSM?
Label.
Labeling? Yes, that is actually a great purpose of the DSM, and a very controversial one that we'll be getting to. And it's part of why counselors a lot of times don't like the DSM. Any other ideas? Yes?
Insurance.
Yes, that's a very popular one too. Some people say it's really just kind of a game for how to get paid with insurance for what you do. Any other ideas about why we have a DSM?
Well, it's the medical model.
It certainly is a medical model, which we will be covering. Who is supposed to be able to use the DSM?
Psychiatrists.
Psychiatrists, that's one group. And
Mental health in
Psychologists,
general.
mental health professionals in general, right? Okay. Who really uses the DSM?
I think we do more than anything because I've seen psychiatrists not know the codes and write out a diagnosis that's related, but it's like it might be affective mood disorder, which is something, just something related, but it's not exactly the diagnosis. So I think we use it more as licensed than psychiatrists.
Well, okay, so here, of course, is my bias, because I'm sure that there are many psychiatrists out there that would disagree, but I don't know about you, but my clients tell me that when they use insurance or any other kind of third-party payer anyway, the most amount of time they ever seem to get with a psychiatrist for initial evaluation is about 15 minutes face-to-face. I cannot imagine doing a thorough evaluation and diagnosing someone accurately in 15 minutes. So that's a good point, whereas how much time are counselors usually spending with a client for that initial appointment, for that code, 90791, that initial evaluation? How much time do you guys spend?
I'd say about 90 minutes.
About 90 minutes. Okay. Anybody else?
More or less. That depends on the
More or less? Yeah, I usually hear anywhere from 45 minutes to 90 minutes. So that's a lot better than, 10 or 15 minutes. I've heard as little as 5 minutes seeing a psychiatrist for that first appointment. It's amazing what I hear from my clients. What I've never heard from anybody is an hour. The only exception is psychiatrists who do not accept any form of insurance, Medicaid or Medicare, who are expensive and out of pocket. I do know some psychiatrists who will spend 2 to 4 hours with somebody evaluating them before they'll consider prescribing medication, but they're expensive and they won't accept insurance, of course. And of course, the reason for that is because insurance does not pay a whole lot, and the psychiatrist's time is very, very valuable, so they don't spend a whole lot of time in some cases. That's the feedback I get from my clients anyway. Well, the DSM's purpose, as stated in the DSM itself, is to assist trained clinicians, so that's a key phrase there, in the diagnosis of a patient's mental disorders as part of a case formulation assessment that leads to a fully informed treatment plan for each individual. So it's viewed as a tool for clinicians to use to help them with the end goal of treatment. Treatment planning and carrying out a treatment. Now, can you think of any other reasons, though, that people use the DSM out there that don't have anything to do with its intended purpose necessarily?
Well, they might have symptoms themselves, and they might want to, you mean like non-clinical people?
Well, could be. Yeah, there are lots of people out there that it's the same crowd that goes to WebMD every time that something physically feels off and they self-diagnose. Yes, some people go in there and they're like, oh my gosh, I have a bunch of these, right? Those are also called grad students. A lot of grad students, when they're first learning the DSM, they're going through, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble, right?
And I remember when I was doing my undergraduate, my supervisor said, that should be your Bible. Everything you need to know is in there. If you want to find out what's going on, go look at it.
Ah, okay. So you had a professor that actually told you that should be your Bible.
Yeah,
DSM.
and that field, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think it's a little sub-Bible. I think I don't quite elevate it to Bible status. But it is, I think, the best diagnostic system that we have available to us at present. And we have to know, we'll get to that in just a moment. How about this? How about using the DSM to determine eligibility for social programs? Like determining eligibility for disability, or determining eligibility for vocational rehabilitation programs and so forth. That's outside of the scope of the stated purpose of the DSM-5, as you see on this slide, and as you see in the DSM itself. What's another way that people use it outside of its intended scope, besides self-diagnosing and besides eligibility for social programs?
Well, it's based on statistics, and maybe someone that is doing research just wants to grab some of the, how many of the, or how much of the population is on this diagnosis or whatever,
So it is used for research purposes, for people that are studying and reporting epidemiology, that sort of thing. Yes, collects all this information together about all these different disorders. So a lot of people forget the statistical part of the diagnostic and statistical manual, because it really seems to be more used for diagnosis these days than it's used for statistical purposes, but that's a huge part of the DSM, and a very valuable part of it, even though it's not part of the stated purpose here. Any other reasons you can think people use it?
I think some government agencies would use it maybe for security clearance purposes, or, I know they're not supposed to, but, you know, I've heard law
Well, now
enforcement-
you're getting into something here. So you're talking about, in terms of evaluation, conducting evaluations for people not to treat them, but to make determinations or predictions about them and their future. And that connects us to forensic application, because the DSM is used for forensic purposes as well. And that's not the stated or intended purpose of the DSM. But every time the DSM gets changed, we're not just dealing with how those changes are going to affect the treatment community, even though that's the intended purpose of the DSM, but we're also dealing with, oh my gosh, this is going to have effects on vast, huge government programs, social programs, eligibility for things, forensics, all kinds of stuff that falls outside of the intended purpose of the DSM for which it's applied. And so, of course, anytime you get a change, because of those repercussions in those other areas, we're going to see a lot of controversy that sparks up. Now, even if it was only being used for treatment purposes, we would see controversy. But when you look at all these other variables and factors, we get even more controversy involved because of the far-reaching effects that a change can have. So let's look at counseling in the medical model, because I specifically created this presentation with the hopes of coming at it from a perspective that's kind of uniquely a counseling perspective, addressing some of the discomforts and concerns that counselors have with the DSM. The medical model is obviously pathology-oriented. It's all about disorder, dysfunction, maladaptive patterns, impairment, distress, that sort of thing, right? But counselors, one thing that separates counselors from psychologists and psychiatrists in terms of our history and our heritage is that we were originally people who worked with individuals to make health and wellness and career and lifestyle choices. That's what we were about. We were about helping people to grow and function and enhance their living. We were not about the treatment of pathology. It's not that there weren't people historically that were treating pathology. Again, psychiatrists and psychologists were treating pathology before counselors were. Now, the counseling profession goes back to the early 1900s, but back then we were career and lifestyle counselors, helping people to make choices to improve or maximize their level of function. We were not there to treat pathology. Anyone want to guess when counselors, as opposed to psychologists and psychiatrists, began to treat pathology? When the big shift was?
When insurance started covering it.
Well, that certainly helped. We're going to get to that too. But even before insurance started to cover it, because insurance started to enlist counselors into their panels in the 80s and 90s. It's the bulk of when that happened. But this goes back before the 80s and 90s.
Maybe with the Medicare came in the 60s?
Well, close. You're in the right era, in the 60s, yes.
What about Freud and hysteria?
Well, Freud was distinctively a psychiatrist, right, or a neurologist, really. He was a medical doctor. So in that sense, even though he was providing therapy, there are other therapeutic professions, he was not really a counselor in his professional identity, right? So it's after Freud, but it's before the insurance panels, and it goes back to the 60s. A big hallmark event was the signing of the Community Mental Health Centers Act by JFK in the 60s. This is what happened. That was the area of deinstitutionalization, right? So there was a bipartisan push to deinstitutionalize, get people out of the psychiatric hospitals for several reasons. There was discovery about a lot of the abuses that were going on in the psychiatric hospitals. But there were some other reasons too. Anyone want to guess some of the other reasons we started deinstitutionalized in the 60s?
Probably financial.
That's a big one. That's how you get especially people who are fiscally conservative, right? We can spend less money stabilizing people on an outpatient basis than if we warehouse them for a life and take care of them, for a lifetime and take care of them. So yes, it was more fiscally solvent to be able to deinstitutionalize. Anyone want to guess a third and important variable? What allowed, especially people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, to better adapt in the community versus in an institution?
Better medications.
You got it. The rise of antipsychotic medications. The pharmaceutical companies were dumping a lot of money into research and development, and there were some new advancements that created antipsychotics. They had some nasty side effects. They were really antipsychotics, but they were effective, and for a lot of people anyway, in helping them to stabilize on an outpatient basis, except you can't make them take their medication on an outpatient basis. So then a lot of people argue, well, the jails and the streets became the new psychiatric hospitals for a lot of people. But so there was deinstitutionalization, and guess what they decided to staff the CMHCs with? Counselors. Because they thought, somebody has to be there to help people to make choices about what they're doing out there in the community, and counselors cost less than psychologists and psychiatrists. Great! Let's employ counselors in CMHCs, and that really sparked the dramatic shift to treating pathology as counselors. That's where we started to more expand this stuff. Now, you could argue before that, you had people like Carl Rogers, who his philosophy was very similar to that of counselors at their roots, very wellness-oriented and very focused on client autonomy and choice and those sorts of things. But he was actually a psychologist, not a counselor, but he was a counseling psychologist. So there's a division, a branch of psychology called counseling psychology that has an awful lot in common with professional counselors. In fact, some would argue they're virtually identical. But that's just one tiny division of the APA. It's most psychologists are clinical psychologists, or they might be social psychologists, or might be industrial psychologists, or whatever, but there are also counseling psychologists out there. So that's how we got into this stuff to begin with. We are more prevention-oriented. We like to prevent the problem from happening to begin with, and the medical model is more treatment-oriented. We already have the disorder, now we treat. We react or respond to that's going on. The medical model focuses more on a scientific worldview. The very popular worldview, the further you go back in history, was where people mostly reasoned or tried to answer questions about the world and the way it works and about life itself. It's primarily religion. But there has been, over time, a shift, and the role of science has been expanding in terms of being able to have a worldview, a way of reasoning or piecing together how the world works and why it works and what it's all about and those sorts of things. But that doesn't mean that religion has completely lost its influence or anything. It's just that science has also risen up, and the medical model is very focused on the scientific paradigm. But counselors are a little bit more philosophical in nature. None of us really call ourselves scientists, or maybe a little bit soft science. That phrase is tossed around a lot. My counselor education doctoral program, they say we teach you to be scientists, researchers, clinicians, and professors, and clinical supervisors. So it's sort of a range of different things, and philosophers. The philosopher, practitioner, scientist model. So we're sort of being trained in 3 different areas, 2 of which aren't necessarily a scientific paradigm. So we're a little bit more philosophical in nature. We're not down to hardcore science all the time, but we're sort of soft scientists in some ways. The medical model is very dichotomous. Okay, so we got these things, we sort them into these nice little categories, and everything has its place. And you go in this category, but you don't go in that category. You are separate and distinct from each other. But we see a lot of gray, we see a lot of overlap. We think more multi-dimensional, spectrum-based than the traditional medical model does with its neat little tidy labels on stuff, right? So these are just some of the reasons why counselors kind of struggle with the DSM stuff. So the question is, how can you feel better about using something that is clearly developed from a medical model by medical professionals under the American Psychiatric Association, which means that they are medical doctors or doctors of osteopathy, but either way. How can you feel better about using this resource? That's the question we're going to be looking at. Unless anybody got an answer to this question before we move on? No ideas. Okay. Well, we'll see what we can come up with. So we kind of hate labels sometimes as counselors. Sometimes we're very uncomfortable with them. Some of us are very existentialist. Some of us are postmodernists. And some of us don't even think there's a such thing as reality, so labels seem kind of silly. Some of us are fine with labels, and we like labels. This is a little quote that I got from the Newsom and Gladden text, which is the Counseling, Community Settings, and Agency Settings textbook that I use in my Counseling and Community Settings class with my students. And there's a key phrase here. Thus, although counselors are trained to work with clients from a developmental, wellness-oriented perspective, they often are involved in diagnosing and treating mental and emotional disorders, including addictions. I treat everyone developmentally, but I want to recognize when pathology is in the room with me. So it's part of the picture. It is not the whole picture, but it's part of the picture. When I work with a client, I'm not just thinking about DSM-y kind of stuff. I'm thinking about the whole person, and I'm coming at it from different angles. And this is one angle that I look at things from, but it's not the only angle, it's not the only filter through which I view my work with clients. It is one, and it's an important one, as it stands, at least currently in our healthcare industry. But it's not the only one. It is not the end-all of all things. So keep that in mind. It's not the only resource that you use when you're conceptualizing what's going on with your client. Now, if it makes you feel any better, labeling is a necessity. I say that because even when I tell you, I don't like labeling, I am labeling. I have given you a word. That word is labeling. That is a word, a term, that applies to a particular concept or idea. And in order to communicate that concept or idea to you, I use the label, labeling, right? Language is labeling. That's what language is. Every time you throw out any word whatsoever, that word is merely a representation of something. A label, by definition. So we cannot get away from labeling. We don't want to, because labeling is communication. So that's something to keep in mind. And this labeling can be used to help people. And moreover, there are actually some clients who really appreciate the label. They find it helpful. They find that it makes something easier for them or it validates them in some way. They think, oh, okay, this isn't just me being whatever. This is like a medical condition. It's a thing that people experience. There are some things going on within my brain or my body that not everybody has to wrestle and grapple with. And so sometimes the medical model sort of actually pushes us away from the more moralizing model. The problem is that you make bad choices. You choose evil. That's the way we used to talk about these sorts of things, right? You don't learn from your mistakes. You just need to settle down and pay attention, right? But a lot of times we gotta keep in mind that we're not all dealing with the same brains. We're not on the same playing field. The same, we're gonna have some unique biological, etc. factors that will put us in a different category than other people. And so in some cases, the medical model actually helps people to not be so pejorative and so critical. And sometimes to get a little bit of relief by itself. Sometimes people get that diagnosis bipolar disorder and they say, oh, okay, there are some abnormalities within my brain that explain what's going on, and there is some hope for me too. There's some things that can help me out. Now, keep in mind, we do not label people, never label a person. Label symptoms. These are just words that we use to describe things, to make it easier to help the person. Because which would be easier for me to do? To tell you, okay, so I have conducted an assessment with somebody, and now we have scheduled them for their first therapy session with you. Now I want you to know that this individual feels significantly sad, down, or depressed more often than not, a majority of the time. And this significant feeling of sadness, depression, etc., has persisted for a minimum of 2 weeks. They experience diminished interest or pleasure in activities that they typically or normally would enjoy. They have a difficulty concentrating. They experience abnormal amounts of fatigue. There are disruptions in their sleep cycle, for example. They have a very difficult time falling asleep at night. They have had some fluctuations in their appetite. They've been eating a lot less and losing substantial amounts of weight without making an attempt to do so. And furthermore, all of these things that are happening are causing clinically significant impairment or distress in significant areas of their life. For example, their social and occupational functioning. Nobody's going to do that. I mean, we do. It's nice when we can do that. I could just tell you, yeah, I refer a client to major depressive disorder, single episode, have at it. And you kind of know what I'm talking about, right? So it kind of serves a utilitarian purpose sometimes to have some of these labels to summarize much more extensive constellations, variables. We're not labeling the person, though. We are labeling the symptoms. And in some cases, with new advancements in neuroscience, we're actually able to label the underlying biological mechanisms that are behind those symptoms. But we're not entirely there yet, which is one criticism of the DSM. So do not label people. Don't talk about those borderlines, because they aren't those borderlines. They're individuals who are many things, and for which we could use multiple labels like brilliant and creative and artistic or passionate or whatever else it might be. And also, they meet the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. You can label things, symptoms, constellations, factors without labeling people. And so keep that in mind if it helps you feel any better when you do this stuff. The DSM-5 makes some attempts to stress that statistical abnormalities and political or cultural dissent are not by themselves mental disorders. So there is an increased effort to avoid overly pathologizing. Now, we're going to see some examples of that distinct attempt to avoid over-pathologizing people.
I think they want to align with the World Health Organization, the WHO.
You're saying that online with the World Health Organization, what again?
They want to align.
Oh, align more. Yes, there has been an effort to align more with the World Health Organization's classification of mental disorders.
Yeah, to go with
you'll see some examples of that when we go through the slides.
And, yeah, because in there they don't use the medication model like in here. In there, psychiatrists die quickly. In here, they nursing money.
In some countries, they're really heavy on diagnostics. In other countries, they're not so much. There are a lot of variations across the world, yes. Okay, so let us look back here to figure out what's unique about the DSM-5. This tiny little bitty, tiny little yellow thing at the very, very top, on top of this thing, this little yellow thing, that is the first DSM. It was published in 1952.
It was 15 pages.
It was almost like a little pamphlet. I have a copy of every DSM. But not the hard copies. I have a PDF version of every DSM. So I can look at them on my iPad, and they have some really interesting things in them. The original DSM had a bunch of very brief descriptions of disorders or syndromes that were mostly described from almost a psychodynamic kind of perspective. But then we got bigger with the DSM in 1968. I mean, that's probably, like 5 times the size of the first one. And then, bam, this huge thing came out, this DSM-3 in 1980. That was a paradigm shift in the world of psychiatry, under the leadership of a psychiatrist named Robert Spitzer. See, what happened prior to the DSM-3 is that, a few things historically. Number one, the psychiatrist was the closest thing to God in a hospital, in a psychiatric hospital setting, or even an outpatient setting for that matter. Your disorder was whatever the psychiatrist said your disorder was. Psychiatrists were not very reliable in terms of diagnosis, in terms of inter-rater reliability. One psychiatrist could meet with a client and say, oh, this is the explanation of what's going on with this person. It would usually be a very psychodynamic explanation. And another one would say, no, this is what's going on with this person. Have 2 entirely different labels. What Spitzer decided is we need to get a little bit more scientific. We need to be like the other medical professions. We need to have very specific criteria so that 2 clinicians meeting with the same client who both do a thorough interview are highly likely to come up with very similar labels. So the DSM-3 was intended to increase reliability with diagnosis. And there's a lot of evidence that it did just that. A lot of really good evidence that it did. Robert Spitzer, as a little side note, was one of the first psychiatrists to really heavily advocate for homosexuality being removed from the DSM. He was a huge activist in that area because he said, this isn't disorder, this is just different. It's a statistical differentiation, but it's not a disorder in and of itself. The way that society responds to it is disorder, but it itself is not disorder. And he was the guy behind the DSM-5. Now, a lot of people give some good criticism, though, on how did they come up with the DSM-5, what means did they use, and were those the most valid ways to create a diagnostic system. But what's a little bit less arguable is that it increased reliability. So, actually we have a slide on the difference between validity and reliability in a second, so I'll hold off on that for a moment in case anybody needs a review. But you notice with each edition we got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, so over time it's like, okay, this is ridiculous. Everything is in the DSM. Everything's a mental disorder now. Mental disorders are dramatically on the rise, but maybe that's just because everything's a mental disorder. But what do you see different here? It's smaller looking, isn't it? It's a little bit smaller than the DSM-4 ones. Which is one thing they hoped to do. They hoped to shrink it a little bit. I'll tell you how they did it in a few minutes. One big way they did it was they would take different disorders. The rule of thumb with DSM-5 is whenever possible, if you have one or more disorders that are very similar to each other, with the exception of severity, then you merge them all together into one disorder, but you create a spectrum to differentiate the level of severity. But they're not separate and distinct disorders, they're the same disorder, they're just different severity levels. Yes?
Do you know the reason why they don't do the blood test anymore?
The block test?
Blood, yeah, the blood.
Oh, the blood test. I don't. Can you be more specific? Like a blood test for what?
Yeah, like depression, anxiety.
Oh.
See how the brain is.
I don't know if there is a blood test that can give us a diagnosis of any disorder the way that we conceptualize disorders. A blood test will not tell me if my client has been significantly sad down or depressed more often than not for at least the past 2 weeks, and has anhedonia, and is having difficulty concentrating, fatigue, and it's affecting in a maladaptive way their ability to function at work, home, or school, and so forth. A blood test can't tell me that. It might be able to tell me some helpful things, like maybe, I don't know, some information about neurotransmitter levels or vitamin levels or something that may correlate with these disorders.
But how can medication in that case is given to those people? I don't get it.
So you're asking, why is medication given to people with mental disorders?
With, let's say, depression. I
Okay.
don't measure the neurotransmitter to see if it's clinical or transitional.
Ah,
They give medication and then they get hooked on it, and then they, or ADHD, they start giving the kids at 4.
yeah.
At 3 years old,
Yeah.
ADHD medication.
It kind of sounds like, in a way, you're sort of building the case that, look, we're classifying disorders incorrectly. We should be classifying disorders based more on biological variables than on social and experiential factors.
Yeah,
And there are a lot of critics of the DSM say exactly that. They say these aren't real disorders because they're not based on biological and genetic problems necessarily. Some of them are, especially disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, have very strong biological correlates. But others like depression.
And even
Depression, I mean, you can have shortages in serotonin levels and things. Okay, great. Well, is that a symptom of another problem? Or is it the cause? Or is it a chicken or egg? Or they're both synergistic off of each other sort of thing? And it's hard to pin that stuff down. And I don't know, maybe there are people out there whose serotonin levels are perfectly fine and yet they're still depressed. Or in depression, some people have more of the physical symptoms of depression and some people don't. So could we be lumping all kinds of people with all kinds of different causes of the depression together into one disorder erroneously somehow? And that is for example, that is exactly how the National Institutes of Mental Health reasons. Their directors, we'll get to in a future slide, criticizes the DSM because they think that it needs to be more biologically based than it is. But then again, some counselors kind of like that it's not just biologically based, because they're like, there's a lot more to mental health than blood levels and neurotransmitters and vitamins and deficiencies in the brain and so forth. So I can't really answer your question in that sense. I wish I could. Maybe it's an unanswerable question. So another thing you'll notice with the DSM-5, hopefully, is that we got rid of the Roman numerals.
Yeah.
We're not using Arabic numerals. Some of the reasons given for that is that people are losing the capacity to know what Roman numerals mean.
As an example of
The
this.
Super Bowl is our best reference historically for what a Roman numeral is. I believe personally that there's so many men out there that have no clue what a Roman numeral was if they weren't in a football. But that's part of it. And the other thing is they want to do this trendy like DSM 5.1, 5.2 thing or something, instead of like, you know, the DSM 5R or TR or whatever else. So we'll probably, there has been a lot of talk about wanting to update the DSM more frequently within each edition. So we look at the 4, for example. We had a 4 and then we had a 4TR. Well, that's only 2 versions of the 4th edition, right? But maybe we'll see DSM-5, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and so on, and then eventually DSM-6. So there's a lot of talk about more frequent updates, which kind of makes sense because we're in an era where we're getting a lot of neuroscience. And when you're updating something every 20 years or something, how do you make a lot? That's a lot of lag time in implementing what we're discovering. So there might be a case for that. So the paradigm shift with the DSM-5 isn't as dramatic as the difference between the 2nd and 3rd edition, but there are some pretty neat and interesting changes in the DSM-5 that I think actually fit well into what counselors would prefer. The first one is that anytime you have very similar disorders, you try to lump them together and create spectrums, tack on options and specifiers and things you can put at the end. To simplify things, there's just too many. We got a disorder. You could have the same thing pretty much, but you could have different diagnoses for that same thing. Just shrink them into one diagnosis, but create spectrum classifications and that sort of thing that you get all kinds of in depth with. But if they have a common etiology, meaning a common cause or underlying cause, then you try to link them together as well. So differences in severity and similarities in etiology can cause 2 disorders to be collapsed together into one disorder with tack-on options that you can place in your diagnosis. They really wanted to eat away a little bit at the concept of mind-body dualism, which is a very old concept that the mind and the body are 2 distinct and separate things. You see, they believe, and this is a very interesting controversial finding, they believe that the brain is connected to the body and is actually part of the body. Go figure, right? So disorders of the brain are disorders of the body, and physical and psychological are not distinct, separate hemispheres out there, but they're very interconnected, and it's hard to tease one out from the other. Try to tease out, you know, in cases of chronic pain, for example, what percentage of this pain is due to psychological variables versus physical variables? You just can't answer those questions. Because a lot of this stuff is biological in many ways. I mean, we may know, for example, even though we could argue that depression is, we are diagnosing based on symptoms rather than underlying causes, we do know many things that correlate with developing depression. We know about biological variables that correlate to it. We know about experiential variables. We know about different levels of neurotransmitters and those sorts of things. So a lot of that's biological stuff, so how can you say it's just a distinct separate world? So they want to kind of eat away at that idea a little bit with the DSM-5. So you see a lot of overlap between the physical and psychological realms. Now another thing I got tired of is the infamous NOS. Psychological evaluations, many times I've seen, have mood disorder NOS, cognitive disorder NOS, anxiety disorder NOS, 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 NOS. NOS was intended to mean, originally, look, this thing, I've done a thorough evaluation, and to the best awareness that I have, with all the information available at my disposal, it does not appear to me that this person neatly fits into the exact diagnostic criteria for this disorder, but they're just off by a tiny little bit, and I still think that it's a disorder and it needs to be treated. Or, second scenario is, despite my best efforts, I cannot accumulate enough information to fully determine whether or not this person meets the full criteria. But I'm pretty close to figuring it out. That's like what NOS was designed for. But NOS became the diagnosis of the lazy and or time-restricted clinician. You could argue one or the other, depending on what's going on. I think both really apply. Because many people, they would say, instead of going through the nitty-gritty diagnostic criteria, they look depressed to me. Mood disorder, NOS. They could be bipolar. I don't know. We'll figure that out later. Right? So, or I guess if you were only seeing somebody for 15 minutes for an initial interview, you probably would have to heavily rely on an NOS or something. But that's not what it was designed for. It's an abuse of the NOS diagnosis. So they really wanted to cut down on NOS diagnoses. They did that in two different ways. They created ways to encourage clinicians to specify in their diagnosis why they don't think this person neatly fits into a diagnosis. The second way was that they created new disorders in scenarios when NOS diagnoses were extremely heavy. And they had reason to believe that there really is a more milder manifestation that needs to be hammered out. We'll show examples of that stuff in a few minutes. They want to enhance how much it is that you factor in cultural and developmental variables when you conduct your diagnosis. Lots of examples of that we'll get into with the DSM. They wanted to depathologize abnormal. Statistical abnormality, meaning if you have that perfect bell-shaped curve with any area of human behavior, you're going to have people that clump onto one of those two tails. They're far away from that median or mean average, right? And they want to really highlight that does not make them disordered. Human behavior that is abnormal is not necessarily disordered. But a lot of times, we see different and we think disordered, and we start labeling people unnecessarily or incorrectly. Every diagnosis in the DSM has a phrase that looks something like, by the way, it has to cause clinically significant impairment or distress, and people tend to overlook that part. They just look at, is this person depressed? Great, depressive disorder. You can be depressed and not have a disorder. You can be anxious and not have a disorder. You can have paraphilias and not have a disorder. You're entitled to your paraphilias, the DSM-5 says, as we'll get to in a few minutes. Different does not mean disordered. Abnormal does not mean disordered. And they really tried to emphasize that. I think the DSM-4 did a good job of that in its criteria, but I think that clinicians misapply the diagnostic criteria to overly pathologize people because they do not ask questions about whether it's causing clinically significant impairment or stress. In other words, are these things severe enough to interfere with a person's healthy functioning in the world around them? We gloss over that part. We sort of assume that because they're here, that's got to exist. But we don't really check into it. So we just look at, are they sad, are they anxious, do they have mania? You can have mania, in theory, and not necessarily be disordered, or at least be hypomanic and not be disordered, right? So we're going to get into that stuff. Now they also wanted to clean up some language. Keeping up with language is like shooting at a moving target. It's always going to change, so it always needs to be updated and cleaned up a little bit. This is from a very, very early edition of the DSM. We have these wonderful disorders like moron. A high-grade imbecile, not to be confused with a low-grade imbecile. And an idiot. So who knew? The Three Stooges were actually brilliant psychiatrists that were offering clinical impressions of each other's symptomatology, right? Idiot, imbecile, moron. Those were diagnoses. Obviously, those are pejorative terms now. Maybe they weren't when they first were being used, but the public catches on to these terms, and then they start using them in pejorative ways, and then the terms become nasty over time. And so we have to constantly update some of these terms. The phrase mental retardation was not offensive when it first came out, until everyone started calling each other retards, and then it became offensive and pejorative. So guess what the DSM-5 did? changed the verbiage. It's no longer mental retardation. It is now intellectual disorder, or, in parentheses, intellectual disability. Either one. Both phrases are actually used in the DSM-5 tag.
So did you ever use that word crazy? Where people get the word crazy for?
Crazy, yes, that question, am I crazy, that I get from clients is a really interesting question. I'm like, I didn't see that anywhere in my manuals, I don't know. Some of the more bird's eye viewpoint, because remember we're looking at right now the paradigm shift and what they're trying to accomplish. If you understand what their big picture is, what they're trying to do, then all these little nitty-gritty nuts and bolts changes start to make more sense. You don't think they're just coming out of nowhere, out of outer space, at Mars or something. But there's actually a logical connection between the little changes they're making and the big overview sort of way of changing the way we conceptualize things. So you will see, for example, any time that you saw the phrase general medical condition in DSM-4, it no longer exists in the DSM-5. It is now another medical condition. That's the new verbiage. Why do you think they changed that? Why go from general medical condition to another medical condition? Because they're trying to say, well, what makes diabetes a more general medical condition than bipolar disorder? What, is one a real medical condition, the other one's sort of a fake medical condition? So in other words, when people, they got afraid that when people say, they have this disorder due to a general medical condition, that was like implying that the mental disorder is not a real medical condition. So instead they say another medical condition, on par with, no better or worse than a mental condition, right? The multi-axial classification system, axis 1, axis 2, axis 3, axis 4, axis 5, is all gone now. It's all been scrapped. Why do you think it got scrapped? Give you a clue. It's not necessarily that it wasn't a pretty helpful or useful tool, or couldn't have been. It was more misapplication by diagnosticians. Let me tell you how I was trained to do a multi-axial DSM-4 diagnosis. In my first job as a counselor, I did not even have a bachelor's degree. Now you ask, well, how is that even possible? Because I worked in a corrections program. And I was appropriately supervised by people who did have those fancy credentials. I had an associate's degree, and I got a waiver from the Department of Corrections to move into a primary counselor position with an associate's when I was close to getting my bachelor's in psychology. So go figure. Do you think I should have been doing that? It was really a helpful experience, actually, but I didn't necessarily know what I was doing. So I get to this end of this psychosocial assessment update, and it asks me to do the axis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing, and I'm like, I don't really know how to do how do I figure out the GAF score? And my clinical supervisor said, oh, that's easy, let me show you. Flip back in the chart to the first appointment with the psychiatrist. Look at the GAF score that he gave the client. Increase that score. However, incrementally increase it over the 16-month stay in this residential program until you reach this number. If you go higher than that number, we will be in trouble, because then the third-party payer will say they're doing too well to be in residential. But if we keep it at that low number or we bring it down some, they will say they need a more intensive level of care because they're not doing well enough. So that's how I was trained to do a GAF score. Has nothing to do with what the DSM said that a GAF score was supposed to be, but that's the way I was trained to do it. So what they decided was a couple things. The first thing they said is, all right, look, that multi-axial diagnostic, a lot of clinicians would say, oh, all that matters is axis 1. And a lot of insurance companies would say, all that matters is axis 1. And so they started to realize, we feel like people are neglecting axes 2, 3, 4, and 5. Except for in 5, because the GAF score became a really neat third-party payer thing, right? To be able to tack a number on there and try and quantify someone's progress in some way. So they decided, we want to get rid of the multi-axis system because we think people are getting lazy and they're overemphasizing axis 1, so they're not being holistic enough. Think about counselors and what makes us unique. We like to be more holistic. What is the DSM-5 trying to do? Be more holistic. So that's one thing I like about I think it's an improvement over the DSM-4 because I think it fits better into a counseling way of thinking. It's not ideal by any measure, but it gets better. It starts to bridge the gap a little bit. So they said, because we feel like people are neglecting these other more holistic, the other areas of a person's life that would go on these other axes, we think that to look at the whole person, we need to scrap the whole multi-axial system and hope that people will treat everything as being important. Everything includes other psychosocial circumstances that aren't disorders. It includes intellectual and learning disabilities. It includes other medical conditions that aren't considered mental disorders, because we're looking at the whole person. The GAF score became a silly number to try and quantify, put one number on a person's entire area of functioning, when you know you could have two people with the same number and they function in dramatically different ways because their weaknesses and strengths are in entirely different hemispheres. So they scrapped the GAF score altogether. They said this has been abused, it's been misapplied, and it's a little too dichotomous. So what do counselors? Remember, we don't like how dichotomous the medical model is. We like to be a little bit more, we see more of the gray and the blending and the multi-dimensions and stuff. So I would think counselors would like this, that we're getting rid of the GAF score, right? But then they said, we're not going to replace it with anything. You don't have to replace the GAF score with anything, but we will recommend something. We will recommend the World Health Organization Disability Assessment Scale, the WHODAS 2.0 is the current edition. Anybody know anything about the WHODAS 2.0? I like some things about it because it doesn't just give you one number. What it does, it says these are different functional capacity groupings. We have getting along with others, or social functioning. We have mobility, or access to environment. We have intellectual abilities, and so forth. So it gives you all these different categories, and then you create a different number for each of those categories, which means that somebody can be extremely high functioning in one area, but very low functioning in another, and you're going to be able to tell that from the WHODAS. Now, for those of us who are pessimistic and we say, one hand giveth, the other taketh away, then at the end of that whole tool, they give you but here's a general overall number that it all averages out to. And some people are like, well, couldn't that become the new GAF? But part of the other reason why they adopted the WHODAS is they want to separate the concept of disability from disorder. Say, okay, you have the disorder, but disability is kind of different. Disability is more on how does this affect the person's functioning. It's a very specialized area of diagnosis, and we want to get more specific about that. So it's kind of a neat tool to do that with. But if you use all the different categories in it, then you are being less dichotomous, less black and white, less rigid when you apply a number on somebody's function. That WHODAS is there in the DSM-5. The entire tool is there. But it's also downloadable for free online, both through the APA and through the World Health Organization. Because, as was brought up earlier, there are attempts to get the DSM more in line with the World Health Organization, more of an international sort of a consensus on different areas.
And I use that in where I work.
Oh, great. I do sometimes also, but not always, I gotta admit.
We have to do it on every client. I mainly do bios, and then we use of course, the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria and codes, and then we do a WHODAS with each.
Oh, that is great. That's really nice to hear because I don't think most places are using it.
Where I used to work, they don't.
Anyone else using it? I think it's a good tool. All right, so even in the definition of a mental disorder itself in the DSM-5, you see a lot of these concepts that I was telling you about. You see that a mental disorder is characterized by clinically significant disturbance. It's not just different, right? It's got to be clinically significant. You see, it has to result in dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. A more holistic sort of a perspective, right? Usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, and important activities. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stress or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Depathologizing, grief, right? Socially deviant behavior, political, religious, or sexual, and conflicts that are primarily behavioral, or behavior, political, religious, or sexual. And conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual as described above. So they're really trying to clarify, again, different is not disordered, and they're trying to tie in cultural sensitivity and developmental processes and all that information.
What would be an example of that?
We're about to get into that. That comes next. I'll give you lots of examples. Because there are so many things on here that you could be asking for an example of this, an example of that, an example of this. We're going to get right into it as we go through. So there is a forensic cautionary statement. I'm not going to go through this with you. You can look at it later. But it basically says, hey, we didn't design this book for forensic applications, so beware. Be careful when you use it for forensic purposes. Here are some guidelines that might help you to not overly abuse the DSM when you try to apply it in forensic settings. So they're trying to be sensitive to how commonly the DSM is used for purposes outside of its intended purpose of clinical case conceptualization for treatment purposes. Now let's talk about the DSM-5 and the ICD. The ICD is the International Classification of Diseases, which is published by the World Health Organization. Now there are things called ICD codes. These are the numbers that we submit to third-party payers to get paid for stuff. Those numbers represent disorders, labels. So now we're labeling labels. We're labeling labels with numbers, and now alphanumeric codes, which are combinations of letters and numbers. Mostly F codes are mental disorders. So what happened is, a long time ago, the rest of the world transitioned from ICD-9 to ICD-10, and we did not. But we just now did, on October 1st, 2015, we shifted to ICD-10, which most countries have already been using for quite a while. Most countries are pretty close to using ICD-11, which is soon to be released. We just started using ICD-10, right? So, now, the ICD-10 codes are very different from the 9 codes. They're alphanumerics that include letters and numbers. In the DSM-4, you would have generalized anxiety disorder 300.02. That 300.02 was not a DSM code. There's no such thing as a DSM code. The DSM does not invent codes. The DSM merely reports to you the ICD equivalent code of the DSM disorder. So they're saying, we're calling this disorder generalized anxiety disorder. By the way, it matches up with the ICD-9 code 300.02. They're not inventing those numbers, the DSMs. They're just reporting. They're helping you connect their label to the International Classification of Diseases. Now, when the DSM-5 came out in May 2013, we had not yet shifted to ICD-10, but they knew they wouldn't have a DSM-6 at the time that we shift to ICD-10, so what to do about that? The logical thing to do about it would be to list both codes. So what they did is, you see generalized anxiety disorder in the DSM-5, just like you saw in the DSM-4. Here's your old ICD-9 code, 300.02, same code you saw in DSM-4, but now in parentheses, you have the F code, F41.1, that is the ICD-10 code. You are now all required to use that. That was effective October 1st. So if you use this code now, you're not going to get paid. If you use this code, you might get paid. Right? So that's the relationship between the codes that you see in the DSM and the codes in the ICD. They're one and the same, essentially. Or at least the DSM is interpreting which code this disorder matches up with in the International Classification of Diseases. Now the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, provides much more brief descriptions of disorders. They don't go into specific nitty-gritty diagnostic criteria like the DSM does. So the ICD is more created to try and create a common language internationally, more for epidemiology and research purposes more than anything else. Because if you call it a disorder one thing in country A with one set of criteria, but that same disorder would be called an entirely different thing in country B, then when you do research, you get all these different terms and you don't know what's what. So if we can connect them all with internationally recognized codes, then we can have more international research, right? So now this comes from a Counseling Today magazine article, and a series of articles published in Counseling Today that tried to help us transition to DSM-5. And you will see the very top of the list is a V code. V62.21, problem related to current military deployment status. Because people ask, well, if we don't have the multi-axial system, then what does the diagnosis look like anymore? What are we right? Well, basically, you list your diagnoses based on the clinical relevance to you and your client and the interaction that you're having with them. It doesn't matter whether it's a psychosocial circumstance or a medical disorder, technically. Whatever the case might be, you're going to list them based on relevance or severity, that sort of thing. Which means that they're going to be out of order compared to the way they would have looked on a multi-axial system. However, here is my disqualifier. I ask you the question. There are two things on this slide that would get you in trouble with third-party payers. Do you know what they are?
V code.
Yes, and what specifically about V codes?
You have to use Z codes now.
Well, this is true. That's the second thing, is that the codes you see here are ICD-9 codes. Because I verbatim put them up here the same way they looked in the article, which was published before October 1st, 2015. So I use ICD-9 codes. If you use these codes now, you won't get paid, because they're outdated codes. So that's one, you got one of them, but the other one is about the V code.
They would like to prioritize those on the list. You have to have another diagnosis.
Why? Why does another diagnosis have to be on top?
Because
V codes are just problems associated with life in general.
it could be like parent-child relationship or something along that.
You got it. V codes, or now Z codes, in the DSM, or using ICD-10 terminology, are not mental disorders.
Right.
They are circumstances, conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention that aren't disorders. Now, you could, as a counselor, be working with somebody, not treating a mental disorder. They might be coming to you. I've had this happen before. Listen, I want to come see you because I've got this really awesome girlfriend. We've been together for several years. It's great. She's wonderful. I really like her. She really likes me. Everything's wonderful in our relationship. Except, I know that she wants to get married and have kids, and I'm not so sure if I'm a get married and have kids kind of guy. Could you help me work through this? It's not a mental disorder. Now, I asked questions to see if there might be a mental disorder, but I concluded there was no mental. That sounds like a really extremely healthy question for this guy. So he's coming to see me for what counselors used to be about, which is career and lifestyle choices, right? Assistants making choices. So what's my diagnosis for him? It was a V code, now it's a Z code.
Phase of life.
Can I use insurance for my interactions with him? Nope, I can't. Yeah, phase of life problem would be a great one. And that really was actually the code that I used, was phase of life problem.
But they won't pay you for that.
No, they won't. An EAP might, an employee assistance program, but not insurance. Why? Because insurance is about treating pathology. It's about, we have a mental disorder and we must treat it now. That's what insurance is for. So, even though, according to the DSM, you list this stuff in whatever order is clinically relevant, that's the real, true, nice way to do it, the practical problem is most of our electronic billing softwares, they're going to take diagnosis, the first diagnosis you put down, and that's going to automatically be the code that it's going to try and submit for payment. That will create an issue for you, because if you dare to submit this as your diagnosis, you ain't getting paid. And you probably won't get paid for this, and you're not getting paid for that because that's outside of your expertise. You got to go down to diagnosis number 4 to get paid, right? So that's the issue. So that's my disqualifier. There's the way it's supposed to be done in a nice, lovely, holistic way that the DSM is doing a better job of recognizing, and then there's the way that can get you not getting paid for things. So, welcome back. We missed you. We actually paused while you were gone and waited for you to come back. Okay. You have a question?
Yeah, so the way that we used to list it before from axis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's not the same way anymore, or is that?
Correct. No more axis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're supposed to list based on what's your area of focus with the client, or what's most relevant, or what seems to be causing the most trouble right now. In this case example, this guy came in and he was like, listen, I'm about to get deployed and that's kind of freaking me out. That's why that was on the top list, because that was the main focus of the intervention. But what I'm also telling you is if you were to do this and build insurance, you better go down to what you can get paid for. Now, of course, if this guy's depressed, then by working with them on this concern about deployment, you are addressing the depression. So it's not like it's unethical to use the depression diagnosis. It's just that I wish we could really do it the way that the DSM wants us to do it. But
So we don't
if
use
you want to get
the V
paid,
no more? Is
What's
that? What you said, the V, we don't use that no more?
you would still have the same label, but it's got a new code. It's a Z code now. I'd have to look at. Anybody have the DSM-5 app and they want to look up what the code is? I have all kinds of apps around here. I can look it up, but I don't want to take time doing it. But you can still put problem related to current military deployment status, but you're going to use a Z code instead of a V code because the number changed. And in the DSM-5, you'll see the old V code, and then you'll see in parentheses the new Z code. Now you want to use the new Z code because it's past October 1st, 2015.
What about adjustment disorders?
They're still in there. Not much has changed.
Okay.
There is one conceptual difference with adjustment disorders that we will also get to.
Okay.
How much time do we have? Okay.
6:15.
This goes till, yeah, we have, good. All right, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit though. So let me give you examples. I was asked about what are some examples of this stuff, right? So I want to give you a few examples here. Depathologizing. They differentiate paraphilias from paraphilic disorders. What sexually excites you, for example, no matter how weird or abnormal it is, that's not a disorder, unless it's causing significant problems for you and your ability to function in the world around you, in context, environment, that sort of thing. So they specifically renamed paraphilias paraphilic disorders to emphasize that just because you have a paraphilia doesn't mean you have a disorder. Gender dysphoria is the new diagnosis for what used to be gender identity disorder because there's a trend of depathologizing gender dysphoria. We'll get into that in more detail in a few minutes. The NOS thing, they want to cut down on NOS. Eating disorder NOS was a very popular diagnosis in places that treat eating disorders. Because you have, for example, people who have the binging problems, and it creates clinically significant impairment or distress, and they respond well to treatment, but they didn't purge, so I guess no diagnosis for you, and therefore no insurance coverage for your services, probably, right? So everyone do eating disorder NOS in those cases. And so they're going to be a billion clients diagnosed with eating disorder NOS. So they thought, maybe we need to look at, is there a good rationale for a binge eating disorder that just has the binging component, but not the purging component? So we'll get to that. They gave you more specifier options. That's a way to cut down on the number of diagnoses, is to merge disorders together, add specifiers at the end. And other specified and unspecified, that's a great example. So remember I told you they want to cut back on NOS, right? Well, what are your options for what used to be NOS? Well, either they're going to go into one of the new disorders, like, for example, instead of cognitive disorder NOS, which was a common diagnosis when somebody just shyly met the criteria for either dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. Now they have a mild neurocognitive disorder. Because a lot of people would diagnose cognitive disorder NOS because clearly they have cognitive problems that are causing clinically significant impairment or stress, but it's not severe enough for the dementia diagnosis. But they still respond well to intervention or need some treatment or whatever. So that's how they cut down on cognitive disorder NOS. Now, you have other specified and unspecified options. So let's say that I'm working with a client, and for the past 1 week and 5 days, they have felt significantly sad, down, or depressed, and they've been anhedonic, and difficulty concentrating, and sleep disturbances, and disturbances in their appetite, blah, 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 and it is absolutely driving them nuts, and they came in for relief. And they're maybe even having some passive suicidal ideation and afraid that could become active suicidal ideation in the near future. Do I say, you know what, you still got 2 days before you hit that 2-week threshold, so come back in 2 days. Hopefully you'll still be around by then. Because I can't bill your insurance. No, we would do something like a mood disorder NOS in the DSM-4, and we would say NOS because they're just a couple days shy. We don't anticipate that they're going to dramatically recover in the next 48 hours, and they need our help right now, and it's severe. And so we would make a good clinical judgment to bypass the extremely specific nitty-gritty details of the diagnosis and create an NOS for that person, right? Well, now you can't do that, so what would you do in a case like that now? Well, first thing you would say depressive disorder instead of mood disorder, because bipolar and depressive disorders have now been separated into two different categories. We'll get to that in a minute. But the second thing you would do is you've got two options. You can either say depressive disorder, comma, other specified. If you do that, you must state in your diagnosis why they are other specified. Why are you not saying this person's dysthymic or major depressive disorder or whatever else? So it would look something like depressive disorder, comma, other specified, and then you either do another comma or a parentheses and say, does not meet full duration criteria. Because it's been 12 days instead of 14 days of that persistent mood disturbance or whatever, right? So in other words, anyone should be able to read your diagnosis and know exactly why they're what used to be NOS. And they want you to do that. They encourage you to do other specified, but you do have one other option. Because remember, one hand giveth, the other taketh away. You could just say unspecified now. Then you're saying, I ain't telling you why. I refuse to tell you why. I am not giving this person the full diagnosis. And then that would be the end of it. Depressive disorder, comma, unspecified. But that's sort of now the diagnosis of shame. Because that's now you saying, I'm going to go out of my way to not tell you what's going on here. So they're really trying to discourage you from doing it, but we're sort of worried that now we're just going to see people replace NOS with unspecified and we're going to have the same problem again. And not enough people using other specified, which is what they want you to do. You should avoid using unspecified at all costs. I really don't know of a good scenario where you would use unspecified because I guess I could see like the interview got cut short because they had a medical emergency and I can't collect the rest of the information or something, so I do unspecified. I could maybe see something like that, but it really is sort of the diagnosis of shame now. So for the clinician, not for the client. It's shameful clinician. You want to do other specified and specifically state why it is the person doesn't neatly fit into the category. Yes?
So if you say the depressive disorder, other specified, and why, you put all that on an insurance billing?
Well, that's a good question. Because in most settings, all the insurance company is going to see is your ICD code.
Right.
Anyway, care what the DSM label is. But in the event that they ask for more details, or they do an audit, then it will really help you to have that kind of detail available. On a standard outpatient setting, therapists are not scrutinized very heavily by insurance companies. Really aren't. Most of my clients don't need prior approvals. Insurance companies don't call me up and say, why did you do this or that? It doesn't happen to me. I don't have those problems. I can probably count on one hand the number of times an insurance company scrutinized something I did. I'll tell you about one of those later on, because we have a slide about it. But do you want to know why I think that is?
Yeah, because you cheat.
Exactly. Think about it. If I'm going to get paid $65 for this session, for example, and the client has a $40 copay and they're only paying $25, they will pay the person to scrutinize me more than they would just pay me, right? So it's not profitable to scrutinize. They're going to spend their scrutinizing abilities on the IOPs and PHPs in residential and inpatient settings. That's where they're spending a lot of money. They don't have time to scrutinize me. It's not worth it. They still do sometimes, but it's extremely rare because it's such little money they're paying anyway. It probably doesn't make sense to them to do a lot of scrutinizing. So there's that. Validity and reliability. I'm not going to go into this, but basically one of the concerns about the DSM in general is, yeah, it may be reliable, but is it valid? That's a question you basically asked earlier. Is it valid? Is the way that we diagnose and the criteria we use, is it valid? Does it really measure what it purports to measure? Does it make sense? Well, you could say I could create some silly diagnosis. I just want to, come up with like bearded disorder or something like that. I could throw that all over the place, and yeah, probably a good chance that other people are going to also diagnose you with bearded disorder because it seems pretty clear that you have a beard. But is it valid to say that's a mental disorder? Does that make sense? So that's the. I think beards they're actually in right now. That's the new thing. Beards. They're all up. The young guys are all growing beards now and stuff. What's that?
They compete to see which one is longer stay.
It's amazing how trends return and go away, return and get recycled and go away and stuff over time. Anyway, so now this is the crux of the argument that Thomas Insel made, the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, which is under the National Institutes of Health, which is under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He basically said, we're just diagnosing people based on symptoms, but that doesn't tell you anything about the underlying cause of the symptoms, which is a good job of exactly what you came up with earlier. So he's saying it's not really very valid. It may be reliable, he says, but it's not a very valid way to diagnose. And so he says, we at the NIMH, we're working on something better that we haven't seen yet, right? So then people are like, oh, well, we shouldn't teach DSM because this guy says that it's not valid, and even though it's reliable. So let's just scrap it. Well, you can't do that. I mean, KCREP requires that you teach DSM. Insurance companies require you to use DSM. DSM is too ingrained for us to just not teach it or use it. It's on the licensure exams now. The DSM-5, the NCMHC, is that what it's called? Shifted to the DSM-5. The American Association, AAMF, whatever, AMTBRRB, whatever it is for American Family Therapists, transitioned to DSM-5. I don't remember those acronyms. But you get the idea. We have to teach it. But he's saying it's not very valid. We don't like it. It's silly. And so people said bad DSM, but then they didn't pay attention to a couple days later his new statement that he came out with. Which basically said, you know, it really is the best that we have. He said, it represents the best information currently available for clinical diagnosis and mental disorders. Just a couple days later. But he co-wrote that with the president of the APA. President-elect of the APA, right? Who probably gave him a phone call, what? And then they decided to do some damage control and co-wrote a letter together. But, so that's kind of my point. I'm like, I think it's an imperfect system. I appreciate the validity argument, even though there's better reliability with DSM. But I don't know of anything better. I don't think we have the technology or the knowledge to do something better right now. But I think we're getting there, and over time we'll eventually have something much better than what we have today. I feel very confident about that. But I feel like it's the best that we can do right now with our limited knowledge. But that's just my personal opinion. And of course, you know, this guy over here says, you know, anytime you change something, people get resistant. And that's part of it, is you know, I accidentally memorized all those ICD-9 codes. It's kind of nice. 303.90, alcohol dependence. 305.0, alcohol abuse. I have no idea what the new F code is for those things. I have to relearn all this stuff.
Yeah. But did we use the word abuse? We don't use abuse no more. It's like everything is used. Is that what?
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Oh.
Nice sneak preview. We're going to get there. Let's look at the structure. You got an introduction, how to use it, cautionary statement for forensic purposes. This is where you see all the specific disorders organized under chapters, and this is all the stuff to come, or the stuff for questioning, or the things that may, or assessment measures and helpful tools and stuff is in section 3, and then your appendix. These are the new chapters in section 2, for which the disorders are categorized. There are some changes here. Now, first thing, part of their making this a more developmentally based model is that the chapters have been organized based on where in a person's lifespan the symptoms are likely to be present or the diagnosis is likely to be made. So the first chapter is neurodevelopmental disorders because those are disorders that we tend to diagnose early on in somebody's life in their childhood. Now you may ask yourself, whatever happened, though, to the chapter that said disorders of childhood and infancy? What happened to that? I thought they were supposed to be culturally or developmentally sensitive. Why did they nix that? They got rid of it. Well, they got rid of it because of two reasons. One is that people who worked with adults would just sort of forget that those disorders existed. A lot of mental health clinicians who work with adults don't think about, could my client have ADHD? Unless the client mentions it. So they don't assess for it. But ADHD could be diagnosed in adulthood, but because it was parked in the childhood chapter, people thought, oh, that's just for the kiddies. That's a rugrat diagnosis. I don't have to deal with that. And then counselors didn't think about things like learning disabilities and developmental disorders as much because, well, I work with adults, that's a childhood, that's in that chapter that I don't specialize in or whatever else. So it kept people from being a little bit more holistic in some ways. And because the disorders in that chapter had no connection in terms of underlying etiology, the mechanisms that produce or create the symptoms. I mean, what does ADHD have in common with pica? I mean, there's disorders that there's no common underlying thing that brings them together except that we tend to diagnose them in childhood. But we don't exclusively diagnose them in childhood. So why make them a childhood disorders chapter? No, intersperse them based on two things. Number one, where do they develop? Put them in the same chapter as related disorders with similar symptoms and underlying etiology, and then order those chapters based on developmental lifespan stuff. So that's the new way of doing it, if that makes sense.
Do insurance companies reimburse at different rates based on which category you put?
No. My contract just says this is how much you get paid for this CPT code, no matter what your diagnosis is, unless it's a diagnosis you're not allowed to get paid for because it's outside your specialty, but or it's a Z code or something like that. I still get paid the same. Now you can tag on complexity codes now in some cases, but that's another presentation.
You have to specify also what your specialty is and what type of treatment you're going to do with the clients. Based on that,
yeah. For example, you'd be hard pressed, even though you are allowed to, and you certainly can diagnose autistic disorders. I don't think insurance is going to pay you for anything you do that connects to autism. Because they don't think of that as much as being our area of specialty. Has anybody, an outpatient therapist, ever submitted a claim for therapy and used the diagnosis of autism and got paid for it? Anybody?
Never used it.
No? Okay. Anyway, so they got rid of that childhood chapter. They renamed the delirium, dementia, amnesia, and other cognitive disorders chapter neurocognitive disorders. I like that because I like shorter labels. That was really long and cumbersome. Mental disorders due to a general medical condition that also specified has been deleted. Because again, that implied that mental disorders aren't real medical disorders. But all those disorders got regrouped into their appropriate categories. If it was depressive disorder due to a general medical condition, where will you not find it? Under depressive disorders. They match up with exactly what they're supposed to match up with now. Would be a way to think of it, in my opinion. The substance-related disorders chapter got renamed substance use and addictive disorders. Why? Because they're now getting a little bit more generalized with looking at addiction, and gambling has got merged into that chapter because of the similarity in the underlying neurobiology of the addictive process in the gambling use disorder and in the substance use disorder. Schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders gets renamed schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders because we're all about getting a little bit more spectrum-based now. Mood disorders got split into two chapters, bipolar and related disorders and depressive disorders. Why do you think they split those two? Well, it used to be kind of nice because you would start off with, do they have major depressive episodes? Do they have manic or hypomanic episodes? So I can differentiate their bipolar or depressive, and that was kind of convenient. But on a neurobiological level, those two classifications are very different. In fact, people with bipolar disorder are probably genetically much more similar to people with schizophrenia than with people with a unipolar depression.
Yeah.
So this is implementing new neuroscience. That's why they're doing this stuff. Remember, I'm trying to connect all this to their overall goals, what they want to accomplish with DSM-5. Somatoform disorders are now somatic symptom and related disorders. We'll talk about that. Sexual and gender identity disorders now broken into 3 different chapters. Sexual dysfunctions, gender dysphoria, and paraphilic disorder. Why? Because what does gender identity have to do with, say, pedophilia? There's no connection between the two except one thing. All those words make us think about sex. So we decided anything that makes us think about sex goes into a giant Freud chapter that we will call sexual and gender identity disorders. But what does your gender identity have to do with, like, erectile dysfunction. These are completely unrelated concepts, except that we think about sex when we think about these things, that's all. So they said that's silly. The underlying etiology just doesn't make sense. When you look at the symptoms, to lump these together, so they split them into different chapters. It makes sense to me. They didn't do that just because they wanted more chapters. That's not them growing the number of disorders. That's just reorganizing them in ways that make more sense based on symptoms and common causes. The chapter adjustment disorders got eliminated. How many? I just saw interesting facial expressions, and those facial expressions look like some form of anxiety. Why? Because adjustment disorder diagnoses are so common among outpatient therapists. So everyone freaks out when they see this, but don't worry. There are still adjustment disorders. They just got moved, that's all. They're just not in their own. They got lumped in with the trauma and stress-related disorders chapter. This is the way they now conceptualize it. Adjustment disorders are supposed to be milder, remember the difference of severity focus? Milder, yet maladaptive and excessive emotional responses to psychosocial stressors, usually acute psychosocial stressors. Normal depression or anxiety over a job loss, for example, is not an adjustment disorder. There are counselors who upcode unethically and call it adjustment disorder because they want insurance to pay for it, but that could be a perfectly appropriate response. Now, it might be a little bit different if it's, I lost my job and I want to kill myself. Because that's not exactly healthy or normal necessarily. So I'm not saying that that adjustment disorders don't exist. I'm just saying that normal, unpleasant emotions connected to acute psychosocial stressors are not pathological, so why would you call it a disorder? And a lot of counselors do that just so they can do more preventative work with somebody and have insurance pay for it instead of the client paying out of pocket. Or using the EAP program, which would be appropriate benefit for a scenario like that. Anyway, so it's milder yet still clinically significant emotional responses to acute psychosocial stressors. That's adjustment disorders. On the other opposite of the spectrum, we have post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we've got acute stress disorder in between. Spectrum. Right? So that's why they're all together now in one chapter. Other conditions that may be focused on clinical attention has now been renamed other mental disorders. Several disorders that were in that chapter have been shifted to other mental disorders. That doesn't mean all the V codes became mental disorders. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there were disorders in that chapter that got shifted into another mental disorders chapter. All right, now let's look at the diagnoses themselves, the specific disorder level. We saw the chapters, we get what they're trying to do there. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Mental retardation, renamed intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder. Severity is now determined by adaptive functioning and not an IQ score. Why? Think number one, cultural sensitivity. IQ scores do not as accurately portray the intellectual abilities of minorities, people who are not from the dominant culture. That's because the tests are normed very well for other populations, not necessarily because of some kind of intellectual inferiority of minority groups. So that's one justification. But another one is the IQ score isn't what's most relevant. How they function in the world around them is what's more relevant. As a counselor, I appreciate that. I don't care as much about the number they tested at on some silly test. I care more. It's not that that's not important, because it does have some predictive value, but it's limited. I care more about, in the real world, how are they functioning in relationships, socially, academically, etc. That's what I'm more concerned about. So I like that now severity is not based on a number on a test.
But also,
It's now based on how well you're functioning. Yes?
but also in the schools, they want kids to be like sitting quiet and not talking, and it's like if you get disrupted, oh, ADHD. You have to go and be prescribed medication so you can behave best.
There are some changes that I hope will cut back on some of this stuff. She's basically talking about over or premature diagnosis of ADHD and then maybe unnecessarily medicating children. We'll get to that. Expressive language disorder, mixed receptive expressive language disorder, but combined into one language disorder with different subtypes because they're very common disorders. Phonological disorder has been renamed speech sound disorder because it's more descriptive of the actual symptoms. Stuttering has been renamed childhood onset fluency disorder because stuttering became pejorative in pop culture. There's a new diagnosis called social pragmatic communication disorder. It is, think of it as half of autism. It's the social deficits half. In a scenario where someone does not have the repetitive, restrictive behaviors and routines and preferences and interests and so forth. So it's like half of autism. Because there are a lot of people who would get like this NOS diagnosis who now will get this diagnosis, the social pragmatic communication disorder, which does a good job of describing exactly what the diagnostic criteria for the disorder is about. It's, that person just kind of doesn't get it socially, and it creates substantial problems for themselves and other people. I have a client like this. He came and said, I've been diagnosed repeatedly with Asperger's. But in the DSM-5, he doesn't have Asperger's. He has social pragmatic communication disorder. Because he lacks the repetitive and restrictive, fixated interests and routines and all that stuff, that obsessive compulsive-y kind of stuff that comes along with traditional Asperger's. He lacks that, but oh my goodness, he has the social part now. So that's the diagnosis that I gave him. We won't spend time going through all the nitty-gritty. Yes? Did you have your hand up? No? Okay. So we also now have an autism spectrum disorder. We took autism, Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrated disorder, pervasive developmental disorder, and said, basically, on biological and symptom level, they're all the same disorder. They just vary in terms of severity and level of required support. It's really the fundamental difference between these diagnoses. People thought of Asperger's as autism light, for example. Now it is autism spectrum disorder level 1, probably, or that sort of thing. So you get these different levels based on how much support the person requires, which connects more to the whole purpose of labeling is about intervention, treatment. So I kind of like that. It focuses less on the symptoms and more on what do they need from us. It's kind of neat. Then we get to the specific diagnostic criteria. The first cluster of symptoms is all about the persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. You don't just see it at a party, but you see it everywhere. You see it in the therapy room, you see it at home, you see it at the playroom, or you see it at school, on the play, everywhere. The second cluster of disorder or symptoms is about the restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Which, remember, I told you my client didn't meet that, so I said he's not really autistic, he's social pragmatic communication disorder. He is not. See, I just labeled a person. But he would meet the diagnostic criteria for that disorder. Alright, so then you get these levels, require support versus substantial versus very substantial support. So it's about, and it gives you all kinds of guidance on, well, how do you figure out which level of support the person needs? How do we define that? So you would say autism spectrum disorder, requiring support. You're level 1, for example, in your diagnosis now. You get all these specifiers that we won't really go into right now. People are afraid, oh, then that means they got rid of Asperger's, so those people are no longer disordered and they won't get services. No, statistically, anyone who had an Asperger's diagnosis, most of them are going to be mild autism. Some of them will be like my client, social pragmatic communication disorder. But they seem to all still fit diagnostic criteria for disorder. And that's actually really specifically, explicitly laid out in the DSM-5. Then we get to ADHD, another neurodevelopmental disorder. They added some examples to help you figure out how does this look different for adults than it does for kids, to be more developmentally sensitive. A cross-situational requirement has been strengthened to say they must have several symptoms in each setting. So it's not just they're gifted and therefore bored in class so they don't pay attention, because that's only one setting. Do you see the same thing in all the other settings in their life? And then what about other symptoms? Is it just one symptom, or do they have multiple symptoms in each setting? So they're actually trying to avoid overdiagnosis of ADHD. Taking normal children, not always being the best at controlling their behaviors and settling down and
And
stuff.
also what is going on at going on at home. Sometimes at home is chaos.
Yeah.
They are just displaying.
Situational things have to be
Exactly.
ruled out. Onset criteria before age 7 was changed before age 12. So they say, well, now they're going to overdiagnose because you don't have to have the symptoms before age 12. But what they found is we lack data a lot of times for what was happening before at the ages of 7 and 12. We don't have a good account of information. It was too long ago or wasn't enough. But if we have clear evidence that at least by the age of 12 these symptoms were present, then that should be substantial and it shouldn't result in any kind of dramatic overdiagnosis. That's the reasoning anyway. You get these different subtypes. You can now both diagnose autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. They can have both diagnoses. That's a little controversial. Adults only need 5 symptoms. Children still require 6 because children, like I said, they have prefrontal cortices have not been fully developed, so their symptom manifestation may be more severe than that of an adult with the same disorder, but with the common underlying biological abnormalities. Okay, so you get to decide how severe the ADHD is now, based on the number of symptoms that the person has or the severity of those symptoms. So spectrum classifications again, within disorders. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on learning disability stuff because it's probably not as much what you're interested in, but all these different learning disorders got combined into one learning disorder, and you can tack on which areas they have the deficits in. So you say learning disorder, reading, math, whatever, but it's all still one learning disorder. That was done in part because there's a lot of comorbidity with these diagnoses. A lot of people, you'd get a psychological eval, be like, reading disorder, mathematics disorder, disorder of written expression, or even more commonly, learning disorder NOS, because I don't want to take the time to list them all out. But now you would say learning disorder, and then you would specify which areas the person meets the criteria in.
Not only that, because you have an accent, they think that you are a student.
Yes, this is very true, so you have to look at language.